So when I was young and getting into bikes, one of the things I loved more than almost anything else was when the Colorado Cyclist catalog showed up in the mail. It was a printed catalog with all sorts of great bike parts in it that, of course, I couldn't afford, but I could dream about. And one of the things that was the most exciting was to look through the bikes, and Colorado Cyclist carried Lightspeed. And in the time in the early 2000s, one of the most exciting bikes was the Lightspeed Gisalo, a bike that, when it hit the market, came out as an ultralight bike with a frame that was under 2 pounds and was meant for being up in the mountains. It was perfect for climbing and doing all of that. Well, for anybody that's ever had the privilege of riding a Thai bike, you know that these bikes ride really well. On bumpy terrain, on rough roads, they just seem to float. But you also got to know that they aren't the best at stiffness. So if you're looking for a bike that is going to have that perfect pedaling platform, these probably aren't the bikes for you. Now, I've never had the opportunity to ride a Lightspeed Gisalo, but I've read some reviews, and needless to say, I think that this bike hit the nail on the head for going uphill, but when you have to start turning it back down the hill, which we do because we don't finish every ride at the top, you start to see where the handling comes apart. You go into a corner and you're hoping that the bike's gonna hold on its line, but the front wheel and the back wheel are fighting like a pair of dogs over a dog toy trying to go in different directions, and you end up not being able to hit the apex. Well, the era of ultra lightweight bikes that only feature lightweight is over. Today, we're talking about the Cervelo R5. So in case you haven't heard, Jonas Vingegaard of Jumbo-Visma won the 2022 Tour de France. And he and the rest of the squad did it on pretty much 2 bikes. They did it on the R5 and the aerodynamic S5. If you want to hear a little bit more about the S5, we've already done a video on that, guys, so you can hit the link up in the top. But today we're going to talk about this bike, the R5, and how it handles in the mountains. Now, if you start thinking about how a bike is supposed to work in the mountains, I think a lot of people get the climbing part where you get to the top of the hill, but they forget that the scarier part, the part that probably requires more from the bike, is coming back down the hill. When you're doing 50 miles an hour on an inch-wide tire, you want to make sure that you've got a bike that inspires confidence. And this is something that I think really goes out the window for most companies when they start trying to build an incredibly light frame. Now, Cervelo and the R5 have really kind of hit that great swatch. They've made sure that not only is the bike incredibly light, but they've made a bike that handles top of its class across everything. Let's talk a little bit about who the rider of the R5 is. Well, I think the first one is probably the easiest. That's people that want a great bike in the mountains. They want to go up hills really fast. They want to come back down just as fast. That is a pretty easy box to check. Now, the other thing is a person that wants a bike that is really high performance, but they don't want to stand out. If you go and buy a new Cervelo S5 with its V-shaped handlebar and its aero ducting everywhere, you show up to a group ride and you don't perform, well, that bike maybe looks a little bit silly. But if you're riding on a bike like the R5, you've got all of the performance, but you don't have a bike that puts you in a place where you look out of place. So let's talk about some features. And the first feature that we're going to hit on is handling. Handling is really made up of 2 components: the bike's stiffness, or how well it stays together in corners, and the bike's geometry, which refers to all of the angles and things that help make sure it can go around a corner. The Cervelo R5 has always been incredible at handling, and as a matter of fact, it's been so good that this new version of the R5 is actually tuned down in stiffness. During the development process of this version of the R5, the pro teams actually said, hey, do you think you could bring a little bit of that stiffness out? The bike was so stiff that on rough days with rough roads, they were actually feeling like the bike was maybe beating them up a little bit. And on longer stage races, things like the Tour de France, they were starting to feel fatigued by the end of the race. So the new bike really focused on bringing in more ride quality, but not reducing any of the stiffness that helps the rider get around a corner. The next piece of handling comes into the bike's geometry. The R5, I mean, it's been known for years as being one of the best handling bikes in the peloton, and the new bike is pretty much the same as it's always been. It's got a 73-degree head tube angle, and it's got a pretty moderate trail at 57 millimeters. Those numbers will make more sense when you start seeing the full picture. So if you want to see a little bit more about the geometry, if you hit the link down below, you'll be able to jump to the page, and we put together a comparison of the R5 versus a number of other different bikes that we've got here at Mike's. The next feature is just simply its pedaling performance. And so I already talked a little bit about stiffness in terms of the bike's handling, but pedal performance is a completely different animal. When you start to think about what a bike needs to do when you're going uphill, and especially when you're going uphill and you're going really fast, the bike's bottom bracket, where the crank arms pass through the frame, needs to be very stiff in order to resist the rider's input. In this case, when you've got a bike that is incredibly light, that makes that problem much more difficult. Now, Cervelo approaches the problem from two directions. One, from a carbon layup standpoint, meaning the different layers of carbon fiber that are added to the bike in order to add stiffness to it, but also from a shaping standpoint. So once you start looking at the bottom bracket area, you'll notice that the shaping of the bottom bracket helps to add stiffness to it. You pair that with the layup, and you end up with a bike that feels incredibly planted when you start getting on the pedals, something that is probably not very often for really, really lightweight bikes like this. So speaking of lightweight, let's talk a little bit about the weight of the bike. This new R5 actually has dropped a ton of weight from its previous generation. The new frame comes in at a weight of 703 grams with a fork at 329. That is a savings of 140 grams from its previous version. Now, there's also some additional weight savings in the front end of the bike, where the stem and the handlebar both drop 12 grams respectively, so 24 out of the cockpit. And then we also lose another 20 grams out of the seat post. That makes for a total weight savings over the previous generation of 174 grams from an already very lightweight bike. A complete bike with a high-end build Dura-Ace or SRAM Red is going to come in right around that 15-pound mark, and this bike that we've got here in the studio with us with SRAM Force and uncut steer tube, all that, comes in right at 16.5. Another great feature is the bike's integrated cockpit. Now, this is something that really hasn't been a feature until this generation. Previously on the R5, all of the cables on the front end of the bike were exposed. The new model features Cervelo's really smart, really well-designed integrated front end. And with this front end, you end up with all of the cables being completely hidden. You've got a channel that runs underneath the handlebar so that the cables from the brakes or the shifters do not actually have to go through the bar. Instead, they run in that channel and are hidden by the bar tape. Once they exit the handlebar, they go into the stem and down through the steer tube. And with this system, you've also got a really good ability to be able to change the height of the front end. I think a lot of bikes with integrated cockpits in the front end end up, having to re-cable a bike if you want to move it a millimeter higher or lower. And in this case, Cervelo's done a great job of making sure you've still got a lot of extra cable so you can move the bike up and down. As always, the last thing that we're going to hit is models and spec. And again, just like we talked about with the S5, if you watched that video, there's not a lot going on here. We've got two levels for this bike. There is a $13,000 bike that will feature SRAM Red or Dura-Ace, and then there is a $9,000 level that will feature either Ultegra or SRAM Force. All of those bikes are going to come complete with carbon wheels and all the bells and whistles. They come in really lightweight. They're fantastic packages, but if you don't have the cash, you're definitely not getting into the party. And that is the Cervelo R5. I think from where we were in the early 2000s with ultra lightweight bikes to now, we've come so far. Now, not only are bikes lighter than they were all the way back then, but they have handling, they have aerodynamics, they have all of these great features that are added in. If you want to know anything else about the R5, go ahead and hit the link down below. You'll be able to find your store if you're here in the Bay Area, or you'll be able to get in touch with our online sales team. If you got any questions, let us know, or please leave a comment down below. See you on the next one.